Late evening in Los Angeles poured golden highlights over the roofs of expensive cars and the glass facades of modern mansions. The air was saturated with the scent of jasmine, which seemed to emphasize the luxury of the Bel Air district. Here among the suburban estates, pedestrians were a rarity, and silence was valued almost as highly as the square footage of land. But that evening, the silence was broken by an angry female voice. "Don't you understand who you're talking to?" shouted Jennifer Richardson, her words dripping with confidence, slicing through the air like a sharp knife. "I'm not just another tourist without the time or money." She stood at the gates of the famous Vanderheide Mansion, a private club for Los Angeles elite. Beyond the metal gates, surrounded by manicured hedges, the luxurious lights of a party sparkled, while muted notes of music and laughter promised an evening full of exclusive grandeur. But for Jennifer, that brilliance was out of reach because a guard had stopped her. "Ma'am, I've already explained," said the man in a crisp black uniform with a flawless collar. His voice was calm, but a hidden weariness could be heard. "Entry to the event is closed. The guest list has been finalized, and unfortunately, you're not on it." Jennifer rolled her eyes, adjusting her designer sunglasses, even though the sun had long since set. "Do you even know who I am?" she demanded, pulling a monogrammed leather wallet from her bag. Then she produced a business card and practically shoved it in the guard's face. "Jennifer Richardson, Realtor of the Year according to Luxury Estates magazine. I sell homes you can only dream of affording." Her voice trembled with indignation, rising in volume with every word. She was used to money and status opening all doors. That night seemed to challenge her, and it was a challenge she could not ignore. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," the guard repeated, remaining composed. "We have strict rules here. If your name isn't on the list, I can't let you in." His face remained expressionless, but a flicker of irritation flashed in his eyes. Jennifer wasn't the first to challenge the rules, but her persistence was far more aggressive than usual. "Rules?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "This is ridiculous. You're just a security guard. Isn't it your job to serve people like me?" The crowd slowly began to gather behind her. A few people stopped upon hearing her raised voice, curious to see what was happening. Jennifer seemed oblivious to their presence. Or perhaps she didn't care. She was playing the role of a confident, undeniably important person, determined to get her way at any cost. "I need to speak to your superior," she demanded, her voice almost cracking into a shout this time. "Or maybe you should call the hosts directly. I'm sure they wouldn't want their top real estate agent stuck outside the gates." The guard sighed, pausing briefly before replying. "Ma'am, this is a private event, and I'm not authorized to give out personal contacts. I recommend reaching out to the organizers through official channels." His calmness only infuriated Jennifer further. She stepped closer, intruding into his personal space. "Do you even know how much my outfit costs?" she challenged, pointing at her diamond earrings. "This party isn't worth half my time, but I'm already here, and I will get in." Her voice echoed off the gates, drowning out the music on the other side. At that moment, something shifted in her expression. Her gaze landed on another guard standing quietly in the shadows nearby. His black uniform was stark in its strict simplicity, and his posture was impeccable. His presence seemed to radiate a hidden strength. "Fine. If you can't do anything, maybe he can," Jennifer said, pointing at the second guard, her eyes glinting with determination. "Hey, you! Yes, you! Come here!" But the man remained still, his face obscured by the dim light. He didn't flinch, his posture taut but calm, like a soldier at his post. "What the hell?" Jennifer muttered, starting to lose her patience. "Why is everyone here so useless?" The crowd continued to watch, some whispering, others recording the scene on their phones. But Jennifer didn't notice. To her, this wasn't just a scene. It was a moment where her authority and status were being challenged. She couldn't lose. Not here, not now. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the immobile guard, her voice growing louder. "Are you deaf? I'm talking to you. Do you even understand who you're dealing with?" This evening had begun as yet another opportunity to assert her superiority, but with every passing moment, it felt more like a trial she had unwittingly set for herself. She had no idea that her actions were leading to consequences that would change her life forever. The guard's silence was louder than any words. The guard in the black uniform, the one Jennifer had pointed to, remained motionless. His face, partially concealed in shadow, carried an expression of absolute calm. That silence, like an invisible wall, only served to irritate Jennifer further. She was accustomed to a world that bent to her voice, to her demands. But here, in front of this man, her words and status seemed to dissolve into nothingness. "Are you kidding me?" she shouted, stepping closer. "Do you think you can just stand there and ignore me?" The crowd gathered behind her was no longer hiding its curiosity. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others raised their phones to record the unfolding drama. The murmurs added tension, turning the small conflict into a spectacle that felt ready to explode. The guard finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, with a faint accent that lent weight to every word. "Ma'am, I advise you to calm down. This is a private event, and I cannot help you." There was no threat in his tone, but Jennifer felt something in it that unsettled her. It was the voice of someone unaccustomed to excuses or yielding to pressure. This voice, despite its restraint, stirred a storm of anger within her. "Calm down. Are you joking?" Her voice climbed an octave, now tinged with sarcasm and contempt. "I could buy this house with my eyes closed, and you dare to tell me to calm down? You're just a guard." The words escaped her lips before she had a chance to think. As soon as they hung in the air, Jennifer noticed a subtle change in the guard's expression. His gaze, previously neutral and focused, now sharpened like a blade. "Just a guard," he repeated quietly, almost in a whisper. His eyes now locked onto hers, and in that gaze there was something much deeper than irritation. It was a mixture of sorrow and strength, a weight he carried within himself, like a burden Jennifer could never understand. Her fingers clenched the strap of her purse, and she felt the sweat on her palms. For reasons she couldn't explain, that simple response, spoken without anger, made her feel small. Her pride and rage flared up again, and she decided to push back harder. "Yes, just a guard," she repeated, spitting the words with venom. "You're standing here, pretending to be someone important, while I'm wasting my money and time. Who do you even think you are to tell me what to do? Do you think that uniform makes you better than me?" Those words, like sparks, ignited the crowd. People exchanged glances, and someone murmured, "She's gone too far." But Jennifer was too consumed by her tirade to notice. The guard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, as if grounding himself. Her insults may not have been directed at him personally, but they struck at something much larger: his sense of honor, his service, his principles. At that moment, a voice rose from the crowd. It belonged to an older man standing slightly apart from the others. His gray hair and neatly pressed blazer adorned with a medal on the lapel caught everyone's attention. He spoke calmly, with an authority that didn't require volume. "Young lady, you don't understand what you're saying. That man wears a uniform that stands for far more than your money or status." Jennifer turned to him, her face twisting with surprise and irritation. "And who are you supposed to be?" she demanded, gesturing sharply. "Another hero who thinks he can lecture me?" The man stepped forward slowly. His posture was straight, and his eyes carried the weariness of someone who had seen far more than any ordinary person could imagine. "My name is Arthur Maxwell, and I served my country for over 30 years. That uniform," he said, pointing to the guard, "is a symbol, not just of discipline, but of sacrifice. Sacrifices you've clearly never had to make." Arthur's words hung in the air like a heavy weight, felt by everyone except Jennifer herself. She scoffed, trying to dismiss their importance. "Sacrifices? Don't make me laugh. You have no idea what the real world is like. All of you hide behind your traditions to make yourselves feel important." Arthur didn't reply immediately. He looked at the guard, then at Jennifer, and finally at the crowd. "The real world," he repeated, his voice filled with bitterness and strength. "The real world is war, where you lose friends, brothers, and sometimes parts of yourself. The real world is standing under gunfire, protecting people who don't even know your name. That man you're insulting might have lost more than you can possibly imagine. And yet, he stands here with a dignity you lack." His words hit like a hammer, but Jennifer stubbornly held her ground. "That all sounds nice, but it changes nothing," she declared. "He's just a guard, and his job is to serve people like me." Now even the crowd seemed to turn against her. People stopped murmuring about her antics and simply stared in silent disapproval. The tension returned, and in the oppressive quiet, only her heavy breathing could be heard. The guard finally broke his silence. Perhaps you, but serving doesn't mean fulfilling whims. It means protecting and upholding order. Even if that means standing here, listening to your insults. His words carried no anger, but they sliced through the remnants of her confidence like a blade. Jennifer felt her face flush with a mix of anger and shame. Instead of stopping, she took a step forward. "Maybe I should show you exactly what I think of your order," she hissed, raising her hand. The crowd gasped, and the guard didn't flinch. His eyes met hers, carrying a silent warning she may not yet have understood. The air in that moment seemed to grow thick and motionless. The crowd froze as if under a spell, watching Jennifer raise her hand, her fingers trembling slightly with tension. Her face, distorted by anger and a sense of entitlement, expressed something more than just irritation. This was the culmination of her belief that the world was obligated to bend to her will. The guard remained immobile. His posture, unwaveringly straight, reflected his internal discipline. But his eyes, now fixed directly on Jennifer, were not filled with anger, but with a deep, almost paternal understanding. That gaze, far from calming Jennifer, only added fuel to her fire. To her, this was inequality, a man of lower status attempting to put her in her place. "What are you doing? Do you think your silence makes you better than me?" she shouted, clenching her fist. "Maybe you should learn what it means to deal with real power." Her words sounded like the cry of someone losing control of the situation. They were no longer directed at the guard, but at her own fears. Fears of losing authority, control, and respect. She realized the crowd could see her weakness, but instead of stopping, her ego pushed her further. Her hands swung, and the slap everyone had feared rang out, like thunder breaking the fragile tension in the air. Her palm connected with the guard's cheek, leaving a bright red mark. The dull sound of the impact echoed against the mansion walls, causing the crowd to gasp in unison. In that moment, time itself seemed to stop. Pigeons perched on the gate's ledge took flight, as if the very sky was reflecting the chaos below. A child in the crowd began to cry, and his mother hurriedly carried him away, whispering, "This is not how we behave." People in the crowd exchanged glances, some expressing shock, others openly condemning Jennifer. But Jennifer herself didn't notice their stares. She was entirely focused on the guard, waiting for any reaction that would affirm her superiority. But he didn't move. His head didn't even turn from the force of the slap. The only indication that he had felt anything at all was the faint redness spreading across his cheek. His eyes remained calm, but now there was something new in them. Pity. "Is that all?" he asked quietly, his tone carrying an intonation that made the crowd fall silent. "Is this your way of proving your worth?" His voice was cold as ice, yet devoid of malice. These words carried far more power than any shout could have. For Jennifer, that question was like a blow to her ego. She had expected him to snap, for her actions to unleash a storm. Instead, she faced an unyielding wall, discipline and inner strength she couldn't comprehend. You don't dare speak to me like that," she shouted, her voice trembling. "You're just a toy soldier. You're not even real security. This is just a game for rich tourists." The guard looked at her with a faint smile, not mocking, but rather sorrowful. "A toy soldier?" he repeated, nodding slowly. "Perhaps that's what you think. But this uniform—" He lightly touched the fabric of his uniform. "This is not just clothing. It's a symbol of sacrifice, paid in blood by those who wore it before me." His words caused the crowd to fall silent. Even those who had been quietly observing now leaned in, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I didn't just wear this uniform here," he continued, his voice growing deeper and more solemn. "Before you saw me today, I wore it on battlefields. I stood under fire, losing friends to protect people whose names I didn't even know. This was no game, ma'am. This was reality, a reality you clearly have never known." His words, spoken without a trace of aggression, cut through the consciousness of everyone who heard them. Even Jennifer, standing before him, felt her confidence begin to crumble. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her mind, accustomed to navigating the world through status and power, could not find a way to counter this simplicity. My duty is not to obey your whims, he added, taking a step forward. My duty is to protect order and uphold honor. Honor that you just tried to insult. But you know what? He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. My honor doesn't depend on you. It's far too great to be destroyed by your slap. His final words were like blades, slicing through her mask of arrogance. Jennifer felt her throat tighten. Her gaze darted to the crowd, and she noticed the judgment in their eyes. Once, that would have fueled her anger, but now she felt something new. Shame. At that moment, another man stepped forward from the crowd. It was Arthur Maxwell, the veteran who had earlier observed the situation in silence. He approached the guard, his expression filled with respect. You handled that well, son, he said, patting the guard on the shoulder. Then he turned to Jennifer, his eyes now full of unfiltered disdain. And you, ma'am, you've just shown us all how easy it is to lose your dignity in a foolish attempt to assert your importance. The crowd seemed to silently agree with his words, nodding in quiet approval. People began to disperse, but their condemning glances lingered, shadowing Jennifer. She stood there, her hand hanging limply at her side, her mind slowly beginning to process what had just happened. Jennifer stood frozen, her hand still slightly raised, as if unable to comprehend what had just happened. The world around her seemed to collapse inward, every sound fading into the pounding of her own heartbeat. The once buzzing crowd had quieted, dispersing in small groups. But the judgmental stares remained etched into her mind. The guard whom she had struck resumed his posture as if nothing had happened. His back was straight, his stance unwavering. The red mark on his cheek, a silent testament to her outburst, was already beginning to fade. But the memory of what she had done lingered like an open wound, one she could not ignore. A pair of police officers approached from the edge of the crowd. Their uniforms were crisp, their movements efficient yet unhurried, as though they had seen situations like this countless times before. One of them, a woman in her 40s with a stern yet composed face, stepped forward. Good evening, she said, her voice calm but carrying authority. We received a report. Was it you who called us? She directed her question to the guard. He gave a small nod, his expression unchanging. Yes, officer. There was an incident. Assault. The officer's gaze shifted to Jennifer, who now looked smaller than before, her confidence drained. Her designer purse hung loosely at her side, and her carefully curated appearance seemed to crumble under the weight of the moment. Ma'am, the officer said, her tone professional but firm, do you understand that striking a security officer is a serious offense? Jennifer's voice faltered as she tried to respond. I didn't mean to. The officer raised a hand to silence her. Intent doesn't excuse the action, ma'am. No one has the right to lay hands on another person, regardless of the circumstances. We can either handle this here or proceed to the station. How would you like to proceed? A chill ran down Jennifer's spine. She looked from the officer to the guard, and then to the rapidly dispersing crowd. The faces that lingered seemed magnified, their judgment amplified by her own sense of humiliation. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That's no excuse, the officer said firmly. We still need to document the incident. Jennifer's legs trembled, and she struggled to steady herself. She realized she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Her mind raced, replaying the guard's words, Arthur Maxwell's stern gaze, and the reaction of the crowd. Every moment compounded her shame. Arthur stepped closer, his expression softening slightly. Mistakes are human, he said quietly. But the question is, what will you do after the mistake? Those words pierced her deeper than any scolding. Jennifer turned to him, her tear-filled eyes searching for something. Guidance, forgiveness, or perhaps just understanding. She didn't respond, only nodded, her head hanging low. The officers began filling out their report while Jennifer stood motionless, her emotions a storm inside her. The crowd had thinned significantly, leaving her standing alone. The guard who had been the focus of her outburst stood quietly at his post, his presence steady and unyielding. She glanced at him once more, and for the first time, she saw not an obstacle, but a person. When the officers completed their paperwork, they addressed Jennifer one last time. You're free to go for now, ma'am, but we'll follow up regarding this incident. Keep in mind that respect isn't optional. It's required. Jennifer nodded numbly, unable to find the words to respond. As the officers left, she remained standing there, her thoughts swirling. Arthur stepped forward once more. His voice was softer now, but his words carried weight. It's never too late to change, but change starts with acknowledgement and with respect. Jennifer turned to him, her voice trembling. How do I fix this? He gave her a faint, encouraging smile. You start by taking responsibility for what you've done and for who you want to become. The next morning, Los Angeles was bathed in warm sunlight, reflecting off the glass facades of buildings and illuminating the city streets. For Jennifer Richardson, this day felt entirely different. She woke up not with her usual sense of confidence and control, but with an emptiness that was both frightening and liberating. For the first time in years, her phone wasn't buzzing with calls, and her schedule, always packed to the brim, looked strangely blank. She sat on the terrace of her apartment, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Her gaze wandered to the horizon, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind like a film reel on an endless loop. Her shouting, the slap, the guard's measured words, and Arthur Maxwell's piercing honesty. Especially his words. Sometimes you need to break down to start putting yourself back together. Those words echoed in her mind, leaving a bittersweet taste. She knew this was a turning point, a moment to choose whether to continue living in the illusion of her superiority or to try to rediscover who she really was. But where to begin? Later that day, Jennifer gathered her courage and returned to the very place where she had lost her dignity the night before. The Vanderhyde mansion was now quiet, its gates locked, and the vibrant party lights extinguished. But the guard was still at his post. This time he stood just as composed and calm as when she had tried to humiliate him. Jennifer approached slowly, her heels softly clicking against the pavement. He noticed her coming and slightly turned his head, meeting her gaze. For a moment she felt her heart tighten with nervousness. "Good afternoon," she began, stopping a few steps away. "I know I apologized yesterday, but that wasn't enough. I'd like to speak with you, if you'll allow it." He gave her a small nod, permitting her to continue. His calm demeanor made her feel even more vulnerable, but she pressed on. "Yesterday I behaved terribly," she said. "I thought I could solve everything with money, status, and influence. But you showed me how wrong I was. I don't know if I can earn your respect, but I want to try." She paused, waiting for his response. The guard studied her for a moment, as if gauging her sincerity. "Respect isn't something that can be earned in a day," he finally said. "It's built through actions. If you want to change, start by respecting not just others, but your own mistakes." His words cut through her again, not as a reproach, but as guidance. She nodded, feeling tears well up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll try." Over the following weeks, Jennifer began re-examining her life. She spent long hours in reflection, putting aside her phone and turning off notifications. She asked her assistant to reduce the number of her business meetings and give her the time she needed to figure things out. For someone like her, this was an unusual step, allowing herself to slow down for the first time in years. She also sought ways to make amends. One of her first steps was reaching out to Arthur Maxwell, the veteran who had been a catalyst for her change. She asked to meet with him personally to thank him for the lesson he had taught her. They met at a small cafe in the city center. Arthur, as always, looked composed and confident, but his eyes radiated kindness. "I'm glad you decided to make a change," he said, holding a cup of coffee. "But remember, the path to true respect is a long one. The key is to be honest with yourself." "I've realized that," Jennifer replied. "And I want to do more. Maybe you can help me? I want to use my resources to support those who truly deserve respect. People like you or the guard." Arthur looked at her thoughtfully, then smiled. "That's a noble start," he said. "I can introduce you to people who need help. But remember, this isn't about atoning for your guilt. It's about learning to see the world more broadly." Months passed. Jennifer organized a charity event to raise funds for veterans. Her name, once associated solely with luxury and success, began to be linked to helping others. She used her connections and resources to create something meaningful, and for the first time, it brought her genuine satisfaction. But most importantly, she changed. People who had known her before noticed the difference. She no longer demanded respect. She worked to earn it. Her voice grew quieter but stronger. Her actions became deliberate, not impulsive. One evening, 6 months after that fateful incident, she returned to the same mansion. The guard was still at his post, but this time, his face lit up with a slight smile when he saw her. "You came back," he said. "Yes," she replied, smiling in return, "and this time I came with respect." It was a moment she would never forget. Her journey to understanding, to change, and to genuine respect for others had begun here. And although the road ahead was long, she knew she was now moving in the right direction.